Okay, welcome back to Economics and Personal Finance. I'm Scott Wentland, and in this series of lectures, I want to talk about government and the economy. First, begin with talking about what is sort of the basic functions or role of government in a market economy like ours in the U.S. and in other places throughout the world. Well, government has a number of different roles to play. So the first is at least a very important one that economists usually like to start with, is government has a role to provide laws and rules and regulations that sort of form the foundation of market activity, right? And I'll talk about that. And then in the next lecture, I'll also talk about generally the government actually spends quite a bit within the economy, right? So the government has certainly a lot to do with taxes. It brings in a lot of revenue, and that we have budgets and deficits and other things that have an impact on the economy as well. So I'll talk more about that later. So first off, right, let's talk about one of the basic roles of government, okay? And this is to ensure property rights, right? This is something that people have been concerned with since the founding of the United States, and other countries are certainly very concerned about this. And the whole reason that people are able to operate in a market economy is because they have the right to benefit from their own effort, right? That's one of the ways in which we can interpret property rights, right? So in order for us to have an exchange, right? In order for me to sell you my house, for example, right, there has to be some sort of legal system or rule of law that would be able to facilitate that exchange, or make sure that, provided that we have a deal, right, that we should also be able to sort of document that deal legally and make sure that that's enforced, right? And so whether I'm selling my house or whether I'm selling even something I've made, right? So if I'm a farmer and I'm selling you corn or soybeans or rice or something, right? In order for me to exchange it, I have to have some sort of right to that, right? And if I don't, then I may not go through all the trouble of even making it in the first place, or I may not go into the trouble of having some sort of legal exchange. So having a well-developed legal system and rule of law, where basically our laws govern what we can do within our society, that this provides the incentives that underlie the kind of activity that we're talking about, the stuff that we were largely taking for granted, right? This encourages investment in physical and human capital, right? So if I'm a farmer and I own my land and I own the seeds and the corn, so the yield from those seeds, right? I also have an incentive to invest in a tractor, right, in order to harvest more efficiently. I have an incentive to learn more about the kinds of things that would make my farm better and make my farm grow, right? And so property rights, having that right to it, is incredibly important, okay? It's also important for encouraging innovation, right? If I'm going to learn how to get the most out of my land and get the most out of my crops, right? What sort of underlies all of that is having the right to sort of sell what I've made on the market, right? Otherwise, why even go to the trouble for doing all of that? Okay. Now contrast this with places that don't have property rights, right? Places like the former Soviet Union, other command economies that we've talked about to this point, like North Korea, or historically China for much of their history under communist rule, also had abolished private property rights. Okay, but that has since they've moved more toward a market economy. Okay, but historically, command economies, or these communist economies, had abolished property rights. In fact, that is how Karl Marx summarized communism. Karl Marx summarized communism as the abolition of private property rights, right? And so one of the big problems that they had in those sorts of systems is that effort was divorced from payment, right? You worked because your incentive was to sort of work for the people. Well, if you worked a bit harder, or if you didn't work quite as hard, right, that didn't really affect what you were paid, right? You had a job no matter what. In fact, in the Soviet Union, everybody had a job, right? You had absolutely full employment in the Soviet Union under communism. However, they had massive problems with essentially free riders, or getting people to work as hard as they would in a market economy, as hard when they actually own the land that they're on. In fact, many of the reforms that China had undertaken in the late 70s, early 80s, had actually allowed farmers to benefit from their excess yields on their crops, right? So they said, okay, you can keep X amount over what your usual yield will be. So that gave people the incentive to work hard and work more and bring in more for their family, right? This is sort of something that's a very basic thing that we take for granted. The fact that when we make something, that we can benefit from it. That's not the case in all societies all throughout human history. In other cases, you have effort divorced from that, and you get this sort of free rider problem where people don't quite work as hard. If you've had any group work or group assignments in any of your classes, you might have some sense of how the free rider problem works, right? If the group gets a particular grade, right, you have an incentive for some people to slack off, right? Because they're going to get the grade that the group gets, right? Independent of how hard that they work. Now, ultimately, as you see, and even in the group work context, you see that everybody plays a pivotal role in terms of getting a good grade, right? But they don't play such a pivotal role that slacking off a little bit will really make much of a difference for them, right? They could slack off a little bit, maybe they'll get a little bit less of a grade, but the collective logic of this means that if more people do this in the group, you're going to have an even worse grade, and everybody's going to be far worse off for it. So imagine that sort of on a massive scale in a society without property rights. So a good legal system and property rights is essentially is an essential part of a capitalist or market economy, right? Protecting others from taking it, or protecting it even from the government or the people from owning it, is a critical part of being a market economy. So in places where you have poorly protected property rights, this can be just as good as having no property rights at all, right? And this is also what we mean by, well, you can have too much government in the case of the Soviet Union, where there were no property rights and the government owned everything. Or you can also have too little government, where the government doesn't even have the capacity to enforce contracts, to enforce the, property rights, so that if somebody comes by and steals the farmer's crops, if there's no government enforcement mechanism to sort of outlaw that and enforce that, it's as good as if the farmer didn't own it in the first place, right? So legal systems is one of the key things that governments do, even though it's only a small portion of what they set out to do, right? But it has an enormous impact on the economy. So one example of this is in India, okay, where their bureaucracy is so overburdened that even to purchase land, in some cases people have to purchase land multiple times, the same piece of land, because you have like this record keeping that looks a little bit something like this. Now, this is slowly changing over time. Okay, so maybe it's not as much of a big deal as it once was, but ultimately they've had a history of not being able to keep very good records for who owns what, in particular land and houses and all sorts of stuff that we do a really good job here in the United States at keeping records about who owns what, and especially with real property like houses and cars and all these things that we register with the local municipality or your local city, right? Your county government knows that if you own a house, they know who owns it, and if you want to sell it, they know they're part of that as well, In other countries, it is not quite as simple, right? They may not have a very effective system set up, and as a result, they have a very hard time with people actually buying stuff, right? A very simple aspect of the market which they're not able to do very effectively. And so you see countless examples around the world where even though they may be a market economy, one of the things that holding them back might be the fact that their government may not be as good enforcing rules consistently and coming up with good rules to sort of help out the market economy sort of do its thing. Other fundamental roles are things that basically everybody agrees on, right? So generally the government providing defense from invaders has historically been a really important part of what governments do. Now, it hasn't been a while since countries are invaded, but it still happens. But you can imagine if you thought that your country was going to be taken over and your farm or your business was going to be destroyed by foreigners, well, you might not invest in that business so much, right? So that's going to hurt economic activity. So that's incredibly important for the economy. Of course, you can do too much or too little. You have to sort of find the right balance for what you need. Providing basic public goods like roads and infrastructure is something that governments do in market economies that basically everybody agrees on, okay, or almost everybody. And besides providing a legal system, right, other rules of the game via some regulation that clarify some of the ambiguities that come up within markets, right? In some cases, the governments can say, well, okay, you can do this and you can do that, and they sort of define the rules of the game. And once they're well defined, then people can play the game, right? So that's part of what the government does, and that's part of what sort of the Constitution allows the government to do to a certain point, or to some extent. Beyond that, there's a lot of debate about what government should do, right? So one of the reasons why we have a constitution or how it exists is it just happens to be a subset or a set of stuff that people care about, that people at our founding thought we should be doing, right? Or there are rules of the game that we should have for the government that we all pretty much agreed upon. Beyond that, there's a lot of debates, and a lot of healthy debates, which economists will sometimes weigh in, sometimes sort of leave it to sort of the policymakers and other aspects where it's not so related to the economy. But nonetheless, the roles of government in the market economy, as we talked a little bit about when we first talked about markets, is that it actually varies quite a bit around the world. There are some market economies that have a huge role for government. Some market economies have a very small role for government. Or there's places like the US where it's sort of somewhere in between.